number 4, Oyster Certificate of Location Rules, recommended adoption of proposed changes. Dr. Zack Olsen, please make your presentation.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. For the record, my name is Zack Olsen. I'm the Ecosystem Resources Program Director for the Coastal Fisheries Division. Today I'll be presenting proposed changes to the Oyster Certificate of Location program with a request to adopt the motion as published in the Texas Register. I'll start with a brief background of the Oyster Certificate of Location program as it currently exists. Then we'll move into a discussion of changes that were made to Parks and Wildlife Code by the 88th Texas Legislature, and then talk about the proposed changes to Texas Administrative Code with regard to the Certificate of Location program. We'll start with this quick program background. In essence, as they currently exist, oyster certificates of location are areas for private on-bottom oyster harvest. This has historically been associated with what's termed oyster transplants. That's when oysters are moved from health department restricted waters into approved or conditionally approved waters and allowed to depurate. That's a term we're going to come back to later in the presentation, but depurate is essentially a process of reducing pathogenic organisms that may be present in that shell stock for human consumption. That's historically been the use of COLs. However, modern COLs, or certificates of location, primarily rely on the placement of hard, clean culture material and then natural oyster settlement and growth. Holders then have sole rights to those oysters in their certificates of location. Currently, COLs only exist in Galveston Bay. There's 43 existing certificates of location. I'll show you that on the next slide. This takes up approximately 2,300 acres total. These range in size from 11 to 100 acres each. An annual Texas harvest from these certificates of location is about 9 to 36% of the total Texas harvest. What you're seeing here is a map of that central Galveston Bay region. These white polygons are the existing certificates of location. Again, these are all certificates of location for harvest. Some other program specifics related to the current program. There's a 100-acre maximum per certificate of location, a 15-year rental term, and various siting requirements such as avoiding natural oyster beds, shoreline buffers, other site-specific stipulations such as buffering between existing certificates of location. I'll also mention that there are multiple state, federal agencies that have authorities over various aspects of certificates of location, whether that's placement of materials on state-owned submerged land or actually placement of materials into the water, such as the Texas General Land Office, Army Corps of Engineers. I do want to recognize, I believe we have Mr. Tony Williams from the General Land Office here today. We've worked closely with his staff in conversations as we've been thinking about these certificates of location for restoration. So I want to recognize that and thank him and his staff for that, and we'll continue that dialogue moving forward. So now we'll move into a quick overview of the changes made to Parks and Wildlife Code by the 88th Texas Legislature. That was the legislature in 2023, and then talk about the proposed changes to Texas Administrative Code. So in essence, the 88th Texas Legislature modified Parks and Wildlife Code to allow for the use of certificates of location for restoration. The proposed changes then to Texas Administrative Code can be categorized into 3 buckets. Number 1 is mirroring Parks and Wildlife Code changes into Texas Administrative Code where that's relevant. Number 2, changes needed for the administration of some of these new authorities relating to COLs for restoration. And lastly, just some general modernization to the Texas Administrative Code with regard to certificates of location. These are fairly independent of the changes to Parks and Wildlife Code, and we'll go into more detail on those in a second. So a brief overview of the Parks and Wildlife Code, Chapter 76, changes, and I'll move into more detail on each one of these bullet points. But an overview, there was a change to the natural oyster bed definition in Parks and Wildlife Code, a change for the allowance of siting certificates of location on degraded reef, removal of that term depuration from the COL renewal process, and then a section of Parks and Wildlife Code added that yields broad authority to the Commission for establishing a program of certificates of location for restoration purposes. We'll start with that change to Parks and Wildlife Code, that natural oyster bed definition. You can see both of the definitions on your screen there, but in essence, the main change here is that the previous definition relied solely on the presence of natural live oysters on a certain amount of area, while the current definition now opens that up to take into account live oysters and oyster shell, and the predominance of those substrates. We'll talk a little bit more about the importance of this on the next slide, but in essence, that's a more ecologically accurate definition for an oyster bed. This next change is the allowance for siting COLs on degraded reef. Previously, a certificate of location could not be cited on natural oyster bed, but now you can see that the department may subject a natural oyster bed to a certificate of location if it's deemed to be degraded. And then the Parks and Wildlife Code lays out several considerations, including the relative abundance of oysters, availability of culture material, sediment overburden, amount of time that area has been exhausted, and any other criteria indicative of a degraded oyster bed. So this, combined with that change to the natural oyster bed definition, the thinking there is it'll open up areas that will be of interest to restoration practitioners. Typically, when we're talking about restoring oyster beds, we're looking at historic oyster beds that are now degraded. And so the thinking here is it will open up more areas for certificates of location for that purpose. This next change to Parks and Wildlife Code is the removal of the consideration of depuration from COL renewal. So again, that's that process of reducing pathogenic organisms that may be present in shell stock. That was a historical use of certificates of location. That's not a common use of certificates of location today, and that certainly wouldn't be a consideration for certificates of location for restoration. So that consideration for depuration's been removed from that language. And then lastly, this was a section of Parks and Wildlife Code added that yields broad authority to the Commission to establish a program of certificates of location for restoration purposes. And the Commission may then establish fees, application requirements, lease terms, renewal requirements, total acreage, siting and marking requirements, and any other requirements necessary. It's notable that for certificates of location for harvest, many of those considerations are actually given in Parks and Wildlife Code, but here the Parks and Wildlife Code gives the authority to the Commission to set these things specifically for certificates of location for restoration. So now moving into the proposed revisions to Texas Administrative Code, these first three bullets are just areas that we propose to mirror Parks and Wildlife Code into Texas Administrative Code. That includes matching that natural oyster bed definition, adding general degraded reef language for siting, and removal of language relating to depuration from that COL renewal requirement. These next bucket of proposed changes are just areas that are needed for the administration of these new authorities, specifically for COLs for restoration. First, we propose to add language to differentiate two types of certificates of location, both for harvest and for restoration. So, namely done in two places. Number one, designating the purpose of a certificate of location from that application process as for restoration or for harvest. And then secondly, specifying no harvest would be allowed from certificates of location for restoration. What you're seeing here is proposals for restoration COL, a program for restoration COLs with regard to application fees, rental fees. I'll note that all of these mirror the existing program of COLs for harvest, with the exception of that rental fee. We are proposing that COLs for restoration have their rental fee waived, and thinking here is that long-term restoration oysters allowed in the water will provide long-term ecosystem services such as water filtration, structural habitat, erosion protection in some instances, and also revenues won't be generated from the harvest of those oysters. But I'll go through these. Application renewal fee of $200, again, that rental fee being waived. Location term of 15 years. Maximum acreage per COL for restoration 100 acres, and we do envision a similar siting and application process for both. We are proposing a culture placement plan and a minimum use criteria for COLs. So the culture placement plan, which would essentially ask applicants to lay out their plans for placing culture materials, the types of materials, the frequency of placement, understanding that it can be difficult to predict those things across a long time horizon, but just trying to get an understanding of proposed activities. That'll be helpful for the siting process. And then secondly, we propose to add a minimum use criteria specifically for the restoration COLs. That's laid out in Texas Administrative Code, but essentially that would be a certain percentage of that culture placement plan to be completed within certain time intervals throughout the rental phase. And the purpose here is that if we give a certificate of location for restoration, we want to be sure that that recipient is in fact restoring that degraded bed and not allowing it to remain degraded. We also propose to modify language associated with public hearings associated with certificates of location. So there is a public hearing requirement for all certificates of location to get public input on user conflicts for a particular area of a certificate of location. As it's currently written, Texas Administrative Code primarily is instructing us to look at when that area was recently harvested, or the most recent time that area was harvested for oysters. But we want to open it up to include a broader array of public comments and concerns in the stated purpose of that certificate of location hearing. And then lastly, these are those proposed modernizations with regard to the certificate of location program as a whole. And these are fairly independent of the changes to Parks and Wildlife Code. So three main changes there. First, modernizing mapping requirements. This would really just allow for the use of modern handheld GPS in the application process of citing and identifying the location of proposed COLs. Modifying marking requirements. There still would be a marking requirement for all COLs, but we're simply proposing to remove a marking requirement that's currently on the books that was necessary during that application period. So we're removing that and just requiring marking in the final certificate of location. And then adding some new authorizations for non-harvest activities on certificates of location, including moving oysters from one location to another, emergency sampling to monitor conditions or mortality, and then emergency maintenance activities on those areas. We did conduct public hearings for these proposed rule changes. We conducted a virtual public hearing on January 6th, public hearing on January 7th in Rockport, and a Texas City public hearing on January 8th. As of last night, we had 31 total public comments, both online and also at our in-person public hearings. 65% agree, 16% neutral, 19% disagree. Those in support were primarily in support because this is offering a new opportunity for oyster restoration, and specifically an opportunity for long-term protection of restored sites, which can provide a lot of ecosystem services, such as, again, habitat, water filtration. Those in disagreement primarily were concerned with wanting more clarity on funding sources to be used on certificates of location for restoration. Multiple commenters were concerned over taking public reef, productive reef out of the public reef fishery. We had one commenter disagreeing specifically with removing the requirement to publish a notice in a local newspaper for certificates of location. And we had several commenters that were concerned that certificates of location for harvest and for restoration would not be offered at the same time. Also a commenter wanting to see different rental fees for existing certificates of location for harvest to match those of restoration. We did receive letters from the Coastal Conservation Association, the Nature Conservancy, the Galveston Bay Foundation, all in support of these rule changes. And we presented these rule changes to the Oyster Advisory Committee and the Coastal Resource Advisory Committee, both of which were in support. So I'll go ahead and state the formal recommendation. Staff recommends that the Commission adopt the following motion. The Texas Parks and Wildlife Commission adopts amendments to 31 Texas Administrative Code 5811 and 5830 concerning the Statewide Oyster Fishery Proclamation, with changes as necessary to the proposed text as published in December 20th, 2024 issue of the Texas Register. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Great, thank you, Dr. Olsen. Any questions for Dr. Olsen? I've got one. If you go back to your slide, I believe 3, 4, 5, number of permits over the acreage and how much harvest. Keep going back. There you go. Okay, you've got 2,318 acres of COLs, basically 43 existing. And you're telling me that that represents 9 to 36% of the annual harvest?
Yes, sir.
So if we multiplied that by 5x, I'm saying, or 4x, so we'll say 25%, I'll take the midpoint of your 2, 4 times. Could we actually provide the full supply required for the Texas harvest?
By the numbers, yes, sir, that's correct. But I will say that there's a relatively small organizations involved in certificates of location for harvest, mainly because there's a lot of capital associated with that in terms of putting those caught materials out on their reefs and then waiting for those oysters to grow. So there's a lot of capital in moving that material onto the reef, those caught materials, and allowing those oysters to
I understand, but there's a revenue associated with that as well, so it's a real business, correct?
Correct, yes.
So, Dr. Jaskowitz, I would really press you hard on getting with staff and understanding how we can expand the COL system. I mean, this seems like an absolute straightforward answer. While we're degrading our naturally occurring oyster reefs, and we've got the ability to create more COLs on a harvested, sustainable basis, doesn't that make all the sense in the world?
Yes, sir. I'll also note that there's currently nothing that keeps individuals with certificates of location from also harvesting on the public reef. And that's
Understand.
Yes, that's correct.
But if we can incent people to farm more, clearly that's going to be beneficial to the ecosystem in the coastal bays, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so let's push that hard, Dr. Jaskowitz. Okay? All right, great, thank you. All right, we've got now several speakers. Let's see. Here's one. Item 4. Give me a second. Here we go. Okay. Justin Woody, Johny Jurisich, Grahame Jones, Jim Mehn, Shane Bonnot, and Marie Camino. If you guys would step up, thank you. All right, Justin Woody.
Good morning, Chairman, Commissioners. Thank you for asking them to expand the COL program, by the way. My name is Justin Woody, a fourth-generation oyster fisherman and processor. My family's company, Jerry Seafood, was founded in 1970 in Smith Point, Texas, and we currently hold 13 of the COLs, totaling 848 acres out of the 2318 you just saw up there. So we know the benefits of COLs. The first one my grandfather acquired in 1962 after he returned home from the Navy. So Texas has 2,300 acres of COLs, far behind states like Louisiana, which has 400,000 acres, Virginia, which has 114,000 acres, and Maryland, which has 8,000 acres. Looking at the Chesapeake Bay region in 2004, Virginia and Maryland saw record low oyster production, falling below 50,000 bushels that year, but rebounded through private leasing and extensive restoration efforts, producing over 700,000 bushels in 2023. Public reefs in that region also thrived, yielding 300,000 bushels of the total harvest. In contrast, Texas produced just 219,000 sacks combined from public and private leases that year. And I would also like to add that we try to differentiate between restoration and harvestable, but harvestable COLs are restoration. We use private funding to rebuild reefs that most likely would not recover on their own. The key difference is that we are not relying on public taxpayer money, we're not relying on grants, philanthropic funding to restore these reefs. Instead, the profits, as you mentioned, from harvesting these COLs are reinvested directly into maintaining and improving the reefs located on them. So I do support the rules as proposed, and I support the expansion of both restoration and harvestable COLs, but I urge the Commission to allow both to open for lease simultaneously. If restoration COLs get priority, harvestable COLs could be disadvantaged because there's prime locations within bays that are good for oyster production and growth. And since we're discussing COLs, I'd like to bring to the Commissioner's attention issues with regulations facing the current COL holders. Currently, from May 1st through October 31st, which is its closed season in Texas, COL holders have no sack limit, no size limit. We can work 7 days a week, sunrise to sunset. When public season opens, we're restricted to weekdays, limited to 30 sacks, and subject to the exact same rules as public harvest on our private leases. Under Chapter 76, COL holders own the oysters, not the department. We invest heavily in planting and cultivating, yet we are restricted by the department during peak sale season. This is like being told you can sell your stocks freely when prices are low, but are limited to when and how many you can sell when they peak. That's not a sound investment strategy, and it's certainly not a fair way to regulate COL holders. Texas' path to a sustainable oyster industry requires more COs for commercial harvest and restoration, strong restoration efforts, a commitment from the commission, the department, industry, to making Texas #1 in the country for oyster production and restoration. Finally, I urge the commission and the department to work diligently together with the GLO to make these COLs a reality. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions? Good, we're gonna fix this, okay?
Yes, sir.
And here's a question for you. Dr. Olsen just said, you know, there's quite a bit of capital required to create these leased oyster bottoms. Is it an economically viable business for you to have these COLs and actually farm on a sustainable basis?
Yes, sir. I mean, the question comes down to the degraded reef. If we're allowed to build on a good bottom,
Right.
it costs a lot less money than if you're trying to build a reef in a mud hole. And so we take the reefs that aren't productive right now and invest private funding and go rebuild them. And yes, I mean, I'm not saying you're going to start big at first, but you're going to grow into that. You start investing, and I think it can work.
And from a sustainability standpoint, how long can you farm these reefs because you're taking care of them? Can you do this over many years?
Yes, sir. So we have, as I told you, how many acres we have, and I work.
How many acres?
868 of the 2,300.
Okay.
And I work my vessels year round on my leases. The only time I haven't was this year in the fall. I mean, in the spring, we had all the flooding down the Trinity, and it killed 90% of the oysters on our leases. And so you also need diversity to be able to go to other bay systems and lease.
Sure.
But yes, and I mean, these guys, Robin and them, can attest, my boats harvest over 95% of our production from my private leases.
Yeah, it's a no-brainer. It really is. So, look, thank you for your comments. Help is on the way.
Thank you,
Okay?
guys.
All right.
Thank you for listening.
All right, thank you. Johny, Jurisich.
Good morning, everyone. Commissioners, Texas Parks and Wildlife, Mr. Chairman. My name is Johny Jurisich. I'm also a fourth-generation oyster fisherman, farmer with oyster leases in Texas and Louisiana. I want to share my thoughts on something that could really benefit our oyster management process, issuing certificates of location for restoration and commercial purposes at the same time. Doing this would help ensure that neither side had an unfair advantage and keep things running smoothly without controversy. Right now, the regulations allow for both types of COLs, but we need some clear language and that makes it a requirement to process them together. Both types of COLs are crucial for creating healthy habitats. I'd argue that commercial COLs are especially beneficial because they motivate private businesses to manage their farms properly. Plus, now is a perfect time to make these changes. Looking at our neighbors to the east, their oyster lease program is thriving because they don't burden leaseholders with the same heavy regulations as their public grounds. Allowing both existing and new COLs for harvest to be managed more flexibly would be a game changer. Thanks for considering this idea. I truly believe that simultaneously issuing both types of COLs could lead to a better outcome for the state of Texas.
Thank you, Johny. Grahame Jones.
Good morning, Chairman, Vice Chairman, Commissioners, Dr. Jaskowitz, and staff. My name is Grahame Jones. I am the Oyster Advisory Committee Chair appointed by the department, as well as representing the Texas Conservation Alliance. I think this piece of it, number one, I support it fully. It's part of the puzzle, along with restoration, buyback of licenses, monitoring of existing public reefs and where they are ecologically, and of course mariculture are all parts of this puzzle. The main reason that I wanted to be up here is I wanted to thank staff, both from coastal fisheries and from law enforcement, who have been working together tirelessly to find answers and solutions along with the oyster industry. We're actually going down on Monday to meet with some law enforcement folks and some industry folks on Monday morning. But anyway, I wanted to recognize staff's hard work and their dedication. Most of all, thank you, Chairman, for for prioritizing this issue and for making our reefs a priority. Thank you.
You bet. Thanks for your service on the Oyster Advisory Committee. Jim Mehn.
Morning, Commissioners. My name is Jim Mehn. I'm the CEO of Palacios Marine Agricultural Research, or PMAR. As you know, we run an oyster hatchery here in Texas. What you may not know, and I've only recently learned, is we actually are the largest oyster hatchery in the Gulf of Mexico. And excuse me, America. Thank you. And we're right here in Texas. We're in the mid-coast community of Palacios, and Mr. Chairman, I agree completely. This COL application is a true no-brainer. And I think it's a vital tool that can increase oyster stocks across our bays, can reduce harvest pressure on our public reefs, and can save our commercial oyster fishery. As my colleagues have mentioned, there are other states that adopt this program now, and they are the highest producing oyster states in America, where Texas has historically been number 2. Most recently, in 2023, we've dropped to number 5. Last time Texas was number 5 on the production list was 1990, 35 years ago. What they haven't mentioned that I'd like to point out is Louisiana and Virginia and Maryland all use hatcheries to help seed these private bottom leases. They use both tools in tandem to increase the density of oysters on their property and to ensure that when there are freshwater events or other activities that damage the existing harvest, they have the ability to quickly recover rather than relying on the timing of what nature may provide on its own. I think we should use these tools. I'm glad to hear that the commission believes so as well, and I thank you for your time.
Great, thank you, Jim.
I have one question.
Yep. Hey, Commissioner, Vice Chair.
Thanks for being here today. I know you and I know you've been at several of our meetings, and also you've had the opportunity to provide some additional information. I'm going through the information that you provided, and I think that the idea of having the seed stock or the feed stock for oysters is also good. So I think that along with the chairman's comment about how we can ease up and enhance opportunities for certificate of location, if we can have a measure where we also can provide that valid stock so that we can get there even faster is another opportunity. So maybe there's more. Stay tuned here.
Well, I'm very encouraged to hear that, and let me just tell you that we will be able to produce them this year.
Good, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Shane Bonnot.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Vice Chairman, and Commissioners. My name is Shane Bonnot, and I'm here representing the Coastal Conservation Association. We did submit a letter in support for these regulations and appreciate the Commission consider approval as they're written. And I would just like to recognize the fact that we have oyster industry and coastal conservation and other nonprofit groups all agreeing on something related to oysters. So let's not let that slip by without recognizing that, and let's capitalize on that momentum moving forward. And thank you so much for your recommendation, Chairman.
You bet. Thank you. Marie Camino.
Hello. Good morning, Chairman and Commission. I am part of one of those nonprofit groups. My name is Marie Camino. I'm with the Nature Conservancy in Texas. And thank you for the opportunity to provide feedback today. The Nature Conservancy in Texas is a leader in oyster reef restoration nationwide, with multiple large-scale oyster reef restoration projects completed along the Texas coast, led by TNC's Texas chapter. TNC Texas holds over 10 years of experience leading oyster reef restoration projects. Excuse me, and we spearheaded the first part harvestable and part non-harvestable oyster reef restoration in design in Texas at Lab Reef in Camino Bay that benefits local fisheries while providing a protected area for oysters to grow. The proposed changes to the rules will allow for non-harvestable oyster reefs to be restored in areas that may better support an ecosystem approach to restoration and create opportunities for more efficient larval transport to nearby harvestable areas. Under current conditions, non-harvestable reefs are limited to areas closed to harvest or must implement specific design standards to prevent harvest, for example, the use of larger rocks. The proposed changes could allow for the best design to be implemented in the most suitable areas for larval transport, complex habitat space, or other desired benefits provided by a non-harvestable oyster reef. TNC Texas supports the proposed changes to the Certificate of Location rules. We applaud TPWD's efforts to encourage a large-scale ecosystem approach to oyster reef restoration that is inclusive of the many benefits provided by oysters, balancing both economic prosperity and ecological health of Texas bays. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, that's it for our speakers. Any additional comments by commission staff? All right, if not, if there is a motion for approval. Is there a second? All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none, motion carries. Thank you. Action item number 5, permits to possess or sell non-game fish taken from public freshwater